Thank you, everyone, and wanted to just sort of welcome everybody back after lunch. This was an honor to be invited back, and I'm going to talk in a little bit about why that is, but wanted to go through first just a general overview of what we're going to try to get through this afternoon. I'm going to start with an introduction to what this thing is that we call risk assessment, and I hope it sets the stage for how I'm going to talk about what risk assessment is. The next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is the historical context. We talk a lot now about risk assessment, but I think it's important to understand where we come from, to understand sort of where we're going and why all of a sudden there's this huge push to implement structured risk assessment tools. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the contemporary context, and this is going to hopefully get to some of the questions that were asked earlier during Dr. Osher's session this morning. So what tools are out there? Which ones should we use? What do we know about how they work? Going to, time permitting, wrap up with how do we actually do this in practice. And so, as it was said, I spend quite a lot of time working with agencies to help them figure out how to actually take these tools and make them work in the settings that they're supposed to be working in. How do we integrate that in the processes that we have to do or that you're expected to do on a daily basis, rather than this being something that stands alone, is completed, is put on a file, and then you go about the rest of your business. I have one additional presentation goal that hasn't been mentioned so far. For those of you who didn't notice, I am hugely pregnant. And so my additional goal is to get through this presentation, actually, in fact, get through Thursday evening without going into labor. This was, in fact, the last week I was allowed to travel, so I was thrilled that it happened to coincide with the 35th and not 36th week of my pregnancy. So, but back to the topic at hand. I wanted to start a little bit here with what it is I mean when I say risk assessment. So, first of all, risk assessment is about a process, and this is going to be emphasized throughout my presentation. It's a process of evaluating and managing a likelihood of future offending. This is incredibly important to understand. This is not going to mean that you know exactly who is going to offend and when. This is going to be something that we have to keep looking at over time. We might have to revisit our assessments, which means extra work, but we're going to have to come back and consider how things have changed. So this means that we don't completely understand what is going on. There's going to be some unknowns regardless what tool you decide to implement. There's going to be changes over time, and there's also going to be interactions. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later in the presentation, but it was also highlighted this morning during Dr. Osher's presentation that we really think that we can affect change. Part of what we're doing here is hoping to implement interventions and reduce the likelihood of offending over time. As such, this means that we're going to have to keep revisiting these issues and coming back to whether or not this person is still at that same level of risk. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but there's many different sort of ways that we can go about this process. The traditional historical approach, and in fact the approach that is still used most commonly today, is what we call unstructured risk assessment. So I'm going to touch on that in a few minutes. There are two different types of structured approaches that we can use as well. And again, when we go through the rest of the presentation, I'm going to try to highlight for you those approaches that are more mechanical in nature, algorithmic, a little bit more like checklists, versus those that allow for what we call professional judgment, or sometimes we use the term clinical override. And so these secondary approaches might be something where we have a list of items that we're looking at, but then we can also use what we know about this individual offender to make additional changes to our final estimates. So I said this is a process, and this is something that for me really needs to be driven home and that we need to understand. Usually we stop very early in this process and we say, okay, well, I've done a risk assessment. When in fact, the first thing that we do is really that filling out of that assessment form, that identification of what those risk and needs factors are. And unfortunately, there's a bit of an expectation even in the field that we can stop here. And this is what I meant earlier about filling out a risk assessment form and putting it on the file. The next few steps, though, really are about integrating and taking what we've done with this risk assessment tool, whichever tool we choose, and putting it into practice. So we need to analyze this information. It's not enough to fill out the bubbles. We have to then say, well, what does it mean? An important next step here is, well, if we figure out what this means in terms of what we think about this offender's risk level, well, we have to actually plan to do something about it. It's not enough to say, whoa, this guy is very high risk, and then put that file away. There's the onus on us then to think about, well, what can we do within our setting with our resources and given whatever time frame we might have with this individual to then go about effecting change. So with this plan comes the need for intervention, and that's where resources such as those mentioned earlier this morning as evidence-based practices or promising practices can help us achieve that goal of reducing risk over time. Unfortunately, I'm a big believer in redoing this work constantly. So this means that we're going to be coming back to, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit later in the hour, about needing to have a time frame set for reevaluation. The question was asked earlier this morning, well, is this something we do right away at intake, or is this something that we do once they're sentenced and put into a specific facility or under certain conditions? My answer to that is yes. So both those time frames are important points of evaluation. The final piece there is that if we're going to monitor and see how the individual is doing, we'll also have to review and probably revise not just our risk assessment plans, but also what we're going to be doing with those individuals. Ideally, if we've done a really great job of doing a risk assessment, we've identified some criminogenic needs that we can affect change in, and we've done intervention to make change in those areas, well, hopefully those are not areas that we need to continue reevaluating and intervening around over time. Perhaps we can move from just sort of prioritizing stability into focusing on long-term reductions in recidivism. The last piece of the puzzle, and this is something that I think all of us are incredibly poorly trained in, is about how to communicate these findings and what do we do with this information? How do we disseminate it within our group of colleagues, within our facility, or even just a unit within the facility? But then more broadly, when we're asked to go to settings to speak to sentencing, to release decisions, or even to the community at large. So I hope at the end of the presentation I'll give you a few ideas about how we might be able to better do that communication process and get outside of just filling out this form. So a couple other things I want to talk about here in terms of thinking about the risk assessment process itself. First of all, we're going to be talking about a lot of different types of factors. One of the things that Jay Singh and I did when we were looking at these different instruments is to look at what items were considered across the different instruments. And by that I mean things like static or dynamic factors. And for dynamic factors here, you can replace this and think about it in terms of criminogenic need, and I'll come to that in a minute as well. So are these instruments looking at historical issues, so things that have happened in the past that absolutely and very robustly speak to an individual's level of recidivism, but may not actually be all that helpful in terms of informing intervention? So, for example, if we're talking about a history of criminal justice involvement or a certain number of prior offenses, well, that's incredibly important information that we'd want to capture and use in terms of informing overall risk level. But there's not a heck of a lot that we can do about that in terms of intervention. There's really nothing we can do to say, well, he's been charged 5 times before coming here. So what we're going to shift and focus on then is thinking about these dynamic factors. And this is something that was emphasized earlier in Dr. Osho's presentation. So what are the areas, again, that we might actually be able to affect change? In the research, we also make a really important distinction between what we call distal or proximal risk factors. And I'm going to talk a little bit about timeframes later as well, but this is important when we're talking about what time frame we're looking at in terms of affecting change, but also predicting outcome. So if I'm interested in how this individual is going to do over the next few months, I'm going to focus a lot more on what we call proximal factors. So those things that are going on with the offender right now. For example, is this somebody who has come into the system and is currently detoxing? Well, what I'm going to need to do and think about in terms of their risk level and management is going to focus a lot on making sure that they're coming off whatever it is they've been using and being stabilized within the institution. But that might not be as relevant to what's going on in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so there, I would be focusing more on what we call distal factors. So those perhaps historical factors that are not as present currently, but nonetheless speak to overall levels of risk. So things here that might be relevant are childhood factors, childhood experiences, histories of early offending, any sort of historical factor that isn't really focused on the current present time. It was talked about quite thoroughly this morning, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but there is an important difference here for us in terms of risk factors and criminogenic needs. And one of the distinctions that I make here is that risk factors speak to what we know in the general population of offenders to be associated with outcome. So what we know, for example, around substance use. We know substance use is an incredibly robust predictor of recidivism. However, what we need to consider is whether or not that risk factor is criminogenic for that one individual standing in front of you or that's being assessed. And so here the idea of criminogenic is whether or not that's actually related to the individual's level of risk for future crime. So it could be that, yes, they are in fact somebody who uses substances heavily, but the use of substances might not actually be implicated in their offending behavior. And this is why I think it's particularly important to consider the use of assessment instruments that allow for that professional judgment or that clinical override, where I can say, yes, I know substance use is a really important risk factor in the population, but it may not actually be relevant to this individual's level of offending. So there, when we're targeting intervention and we're looking for reductions in risk over time, we're going to want to target the criminogenic issues for each individual. And now the last one that I wanted to touch on is this difference between risk and protective factors. And so the whole presentation is called risk assessment. I'm going to talk about risk assessment tools. I talk about risk over time. But one of the areas that I think is really important and that we have a real deficit in the criminal justice field is this idea of focusing on those factors that might actually reduce recidivism over time or mitigate the other risk factors that are present. Dr. Osher put up a couple slides earlier today that really talked about sort of the value of looking at these. And I just wanted to reiterate a couple of points. It's obviously very important from a therapeutic alliance point of view. If we're constantly focusing on the white, if we're constantly focusing on those risk factors, here we do see a very particular perspective of the offender. If we, however, focus on the black here, we would actually perhaps see some avenues for change. So this is a slide borrowed from my intro psych class. But just drives home the point that perspective taking is important not just for those that we're working with to rehabilitate, but on our end as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is that there's a lot of emerging research to show that it's actually not just about the perspectives that we take in our practice, but also about accuracy. So we're starting to see really good evidence in the research that the addition of protective factors adds something to the story of risk assessment and helps us get more accurate predictions of who is really going to reoffend over time. So consideration of those issues like strong social support, positive employment outcomes, anything positive or changes in relationships. In fact, one of the most powerful turning points we see in the desistance literature is coming into new positive romantic relationships or having children. And a lot of that work talks about how this seems to be a point at which the individual offender says, I really need to change what I'm doing. And that's above and beyond any sort of risk factor. This is something new, protective, that can be added into our understanding of how to help this individual. Wanted to make just a few more distinctions before we move into the actual meat of risk assessment. Recidivism is not one behavior. This is not simply one unidimensional construct. So we have to be very careful when you're looking at the research, when you're considering which tools you might want to implement, or even thinking from an evaluation point of view for analyzing your own outcomes. What is it that you mean when you're talking about this idea of recidivism? So the instruments that I'm going to review later today I'm going to try to, as best I can, tell you which one of those seem to work best in which of these different areas. So some tools were uniquely designed to predict new offenses. Other tools look specifically at violations of conditions. So this is going to be a different sort of focus. And I want you to be aware that the risk assessment literature has not done a great job of distinguishing between that for you. So you're going to have to be a savvy consumer when you're looking at what this tool was supposed to do and whether or not the research actually says it can do that. There are important differences as well when we talk about violent or nonviolent recidivism. And there, the risk factors may actually be different, and the tools you want to use might be different as well. And the last one here is about this idea of sexual and non-sexual recidivism. And this is a very important distinction and an area of work that is really very well done, and also that there's still a lot of work to be done in. And we know a lot more about general recidivism than we do about sexual recidivism. And then the point that I just wanted to make is that instruments perform best at predicting the outcome they were designed to assess. So if you're picking up a new instrument, let's say it's the LSI, and it's one of those instruments, and it was designed to predict general offending, you have to be very careful if you're going to then apply it to a sexual offending population. You have to be aware that that's not what that tool was designed to do. So in the next 10-15 minutes, I want to take you through the different types of tools that are out there. I'm certainly not going to be able to review all of the different tools that exist, but at least help you understand which category they fall into, and maybe that will help you make your decisions about which tools you want to implement. I always make the joke that usually this part of the presentation could be an entire semester's course, so I will do my best to do 30 years in 30 minutes or less. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is this notion of unstructured judgment. And I want to put a bit of a caveat out there to say that I don't mean to say that these assessments are being sort of conducted free-form, that people are just walking around saying low risk, high risk, maybe moderate risk. But what I'm saying here is that there's not been a specific tool implemented to structure that assessment process. This is often referred to anecdotally as gut decision making or gut risk assessment, where we're relying on what we know about the offender, and then based on my professional opinion, I'm going to make a determination of level of risk. Now, the advantages here, and the reason why this is still actually the most prominent form of risk assessment in criminal justice and forensic settings, is that it's incredibly convenient and it's incredibly flexible. This is something that you can do everywhere, anytime. You don't need a specific tool, you don't need specific training. This is something that really is quite amenable to the situations that we often have to do risk assessment in. Also inexpensive. There are no forms that are copyrighted that you have to keep purchasing or any online systems that you have to use. And because it is the sort of original approach and it is so widely used, it is also very widely accepted. So going into parole board or probation meetings or going into the court to report on an individual's level of risk, it's going to be quite well accepted that you use this unstructured professional approach. The other advantage here is that naturally when we're doing unstructured professional judgment, we gravitate towards those dynamic criminogenic issues because that's part of our training. We focus on those things that are things that might be able to change. So this is something then that really leads quite nicely into case management and planning processes. Unfortunately, there's a whole host of disadvantages with the unstructured approach. First of all, there is a lot of research to show that the accuracy really differs in terms of training and expertise. And in fact, people working in criminal justice settings themselves will have various levels of training or expertise in risk assessment. A second important problem is a lack of transparency. So there's nothing sort of formalized here to say what it is that you've looked at when you're informing your risk estimates. Now, as we get to the bottom, these are the things that actually start to really matter even more. So they're highly susceptible to biases. We see factors such as offender sex, race, ethnicity, assessors' sex and race, ethnicity really coming into play when we're looking at the levels of risk assigned to individuals, even though that's not something that necessarily should. And there's a lack of consistency. So if I came up with one estimate of risk, it doesn't mean necessarily that any of you out there would also come to the same determination about the same offender. Finally, there was a whole host of research conducted in this area that showed that these assessments were no better than chance. In fact, the accuracy was about 1 in 3. And so here we would have been better off, and the famous statement goes, flipping coins in the courtroom. And there's a lot of literature there, and I'm happy to share individually with any of you who are interested in this work to show that this sort of unstructured professional approach is really not going to produce anything better than if you were to just flip a coin about the offender in front of you. So because of this, we saw an emergence of research prominently by the work of Hank Stedman and John Monahan, focusing on those risk assessment sort of tools that we might be able to develop based on what we know to be statistically related to recidivism. So the second generation of risk assessment tools, still very popular, lots of what we still use today, and these are empirically based. They're comprised of static risk factors, meaning that they don't change. So we're looking at things like history of offending, age, sex, anything that was statistically related and really quite traditionally available on a rap sheet. We see good transparency and much more objective assessments now. We all know the 10 or 12 items that everybody's looking at for these individuals. Some examples of instruments here are things like the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide, if anybody's familiar with that, the Static 99 for sex offenders. These are tools where there's sort of yes/no boxes. You go through, you fill out your 10 items, and you come up with an overall score. They're very quick and easy, and in fact, they did improve that accuracy to levels much higher than chance, which is what we wanted to do. Some disadvantages here is that a lot of the items included in the instruments can be atheoretical in nature, meaning that all of the good work we've done in psychology and criminology and sociology to understand the pathways and mechanisms to offending have not necessarily been incorporated here. And one of the examples that I love to give to my students is that one of these instruments had shoe size as a risk factor. And so I have very large feet, and they got larger in the last few months. But here, the idea with shoe size was that it's not something that I would say intuitively or clinically, theoretically makes sense as a risk factor for violent offending. But instead, it was associated with overall body mass and body size, and those individuals who were bigger were more likely to incur injuries when they did indeed engage in violence. So it's a very sort of removed risk factor, and one of those things that we also can't really change over time. And I like to sort of make the joke there that we're not going to go about binding all the offenders' feet in the hope that as we shrink their feet size, we're going to reduce their likelihood of offending. Because these are static factors as well, we can't see any change. So the risk level that they come into the system with, they serve their 25 years, they're still going to be at that same risk level at the time of release. And that does nothing for us in terms of thinking about reentry planning or what this individual actually will look like at the time of release in terms of risk. So the example that we often receive in training is this broken leg dilemma. We know people change, and one of my earlier points about the process of risk assessment was that we need to consider both characteristics and situations. And so some of the examples of things that we might see that make for change over time is in fact just the aging process. We know that risk for recidivism goes down as somebody ages over time. We also know that with physical changes, we see reductions in risk. The setting individuals are in. I mentioned earlier interpersonal relationships as being a really important factor in terms of desistance. Employment is also a very important protective factor. And then hopefully, if we're doing a really good job of this, if we're intervening with the evidence-based practices and the promising practices, we have good therapeutic alliance, and we're doing it with fidelity, we should see that what we're doing with the offenders are also reducing their risk over time. So for these reasons, there was then sort of a next push to move into other instruments that might allow for identification of treatment targets, so these kinds of things that might actually result in change, and thinking about ways of integrating the assessment process with intervention. So if we think back to my original process model here, the second generation took us 2 steps of the way, but we still have about 4 pieces of that process, or 4 steps along that process, that we're not receiving guidance in how to do. The other piece of the puzzle here is the fact that these instruments, the static and second generation instruments, are really focused on group norms. And this comes back to this idea of the whole group of offenders and what we know about risk versus this one individual. So this is an example that I've stolen from many people over time. Most recently, I stole it from Dr. Stephen Hart. And he uses this example to talk about a group of 100 offenders, 50 of whom recidivate over a 5-year period. And so here, using the second generation approach, we would say that somebody who receives the same score as this group would have a 50% likelihood of recidivism. So the question to you is, does this mean that every member of that group has a 50% likelihood of recidivism? Or does that mean we have half of the individuals who are definitely going to recidivate, the other half who have 0 chance of recidivism? And then finally, another example could be that we have 20 who are at 100% likelihood, 20 who are at 75% likelihood, 20 who have 50%, 20 who have 25%, and then 20 who have 0% likelihood of recidivism. My point here is that statistically, that all works out to 50% recidivism over time. Those numbers would work out to say that 50% of the 100 had recidivated in this 5-year period. So what we see is a violation of what we know about statistics when we try to rely on these sorts of group-based decision-making models, because we don't actually know what that statistic means for the one person who is in front of us that we're assessing. So for these reasons, there's been an impetus or a push to really think about how we take from the group level of risk and criminogenic need and think about that at an individual level. And that's where we start seeing the third generation of instrument coming to fruition. And these are the ones that a lot of you are probably most familiar with. So an example of the third generation would be the LSI family of instruments. And here we're focusing now on dynamic risk factors. We're focusing in on individual criminogenic needs and also allowing for this idea of professional or clinical override. All of the advantages that were there previously with the second generation continue. However, we now have sensitivity to change. We can actually re-administer this and see whether or not somebody is increasing or decreasing in risk for recidivism as a function of what we're doing. We're also focusing on the identification of real treatment or intervention targets, things that we can do something about with those evidence-based and promising practices. Because of that fact that we're looking at change, we are going to have to come back to this. By definition, we're saying that these things can change. And as a result, we have to go back and see whether or not they changed. They are more time-consuming. These instruments are not as easily completed as simply looking at a rap sheet or a referral sheet now. These are going to be issues that we need to think about probably over longer periods of time or through interviews with the offender, with collaterals, or some other form of information gathering. The last problem that we had with the third generation is that though we were identifying treatment targets, we might have gone through the assessment and said, okay, well, here are the 4 or 5 things that seem to be really relevant, that we actually have approaches and interventions that we know work if we wanted to do something about it. Now, we don't know exactly what to do with that yet. So it hasn't really integrated this into the case planning process. So we've come another step along the way, but we haven't really formulated a strategy for that plan, that intervention. So the most recent generation that we see is this 4th generation, which really integrates the case planning. And the example given earlier of the LSI-CMI, or the LS-CMI, is one of these 4th generation instruments, because this is where we're taking the risk assessment, identifying those treatment relevant targets, and putting that into a case plan. So all the same advantages that we saw for the 3rd generation, but here we're now incorporating intervention. So the full picture of the process of risk assessment now is complete, and this is really where I think we need to put our efforts when we're talking about wanting to integrate assessment and management. Now, it doesn't mean that your particular setting is going to want to go into the case planning process. In fact, you might be in a setting where your job or your unit's job is to really just identify a level of risk to triage or screen and then pass them off to the next group who is going to need to do this more thorough evaluation. Wanted to just point out here that in addition to some of the other disadvantages we saw with the 3rd generation, this is relatively new. And so we know quite a lot less in the research about how well these things work. It all looks very promising. I have no data to suggest that they aren't improving outcomes, but we also have very little research just completed because these instruments are not that old. So that leads me to talk about the status of risk assessment, and I'm going to get into a little bit about the nitty-gritty of the tools that are out there and which ones might suit your setting best. So with JSING, we went ahead and did a review of all of the different instruments that we could find that were being used in correctional settings in the United States. We looked at those that were being used sort of on an individual level, so those instruments that were more jurisdiction specific, and then also looked at those that seemed to be used more broadly and tried to figure out which ones had the best research behind them and seemed to be working the best. So we, first of all, see a dramatic rise, even though it still is dominated by unstructured professional judgment. Pretty much every agency now is at least aware of the notion that they're supposed to be moving into, or that there exists this world of structured risk assessment. We identified more than 60 different risk assessment tools, and these were just on general recidivism. So this was not looking at violence, this was not looking at sexual offending, but this was more than 60 tools that were currently being used across the United States in correctional facilities. About a third of those were general broad use tools, meaning that they weren't developed in any specific jurisdiction, and then about 40 of them were more jurisdiction specific. And if I have one recommendation, and I get a lot of phone calls and emails asking me which tool should I be using, my one recommendation is whatever you do, pick one of these and do not create your own tool. There is absolutely no reason that we can't find something that exists, that is well validated and can be adapted for your setting, rather than coming up with a new tool that has no research behind it and that you're not sure whether or not it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. These 60 tools that we looked at varied tremendously in terms of their intended population, the intended outcome. Some tools were, like I said, for those different specific forms of recidivism. Some tools were for parolees or probationers specifically. Some were for women, some were for different subsets of a population. They also differed widely in content. So those distinctions that I made earlier about historical versus dynamic factors or risk versus protective factors, these are some of the things that we need to look at when we're considering which tool might best suit your setting. They also differed in approach, so whether or not they, sort of what generation they fit in, and whether or not they had integration of case planning and allowed for professional override. The last two I want to really drive home as perhaps maybe the most important 2 points is that they also differed tremendously in length. Some tools were very short, 4 items that would serve more appropriately as screening tools. Other tools had 100, 200 plus items. That's going to take a very different amount of time, and when we're talking about implementation, we need to consider whether or not that's realistic and feasible and sustainable over time. Related to that is cost. Some of these are free. Others require significant costs associated with training, with staff, and also copyright issues over time. So this is the list of tools that we came up with that appeared to be on a broad general basis, most widely used across the United States. And I put up there next to each instrument whether or not they included dynamic factors. So that's what the D refers to here. And in general, most of the tools actually did, so these would reflect more of the 3rd generation of instrument, meaning that they're going to allow for some identification of treatment targets. Only 2 of the instruments, so the inventory of offender risks, needs, and strengths, the IORNs, and also the SPIN, the service planning instruments, those are the only 2 that included any consideration of protective factors. I wanted to just touch on a couple other instruments that you'll hear actually throughout the next few days, and I want to be clear that these are not actually what we're talking about when we say recidivism risk assessment tools. So we also identified a lot of instruments that were being used as recidivism tools but aren't actually in that category. So the first one is violence risk assessment tools. Now these are designed to predict violence specifically and actually have different content than those that are designed to predict general recidivism. There, of course, is a lot of overlap here, but something like the VRAG, the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide, or the HCR20 was originally designed with violence in mind and not necessarily violent offending, so violent behavior more generally. We also see a heavy reliance in the field on personality assessment tools, and the classic example here is tools designed to assess psychopathy, so something like the psychopathy checklist. And so this, yes, really is highly correlated with recidivism. I will not argue that point. However, when you're saying that you're doing a recidivism risk assessment and you use the PCL or the psychopathy checklist, that's not actually the same thing. This is but one risk factor of a dozen or more that should be considered. Similarly, criminal thinking questionnaires, such as the ones developed by TCU or the PICS, the Psychological Inventory of Criminal Thinking, I think that's the acronym. These are, again, going to speak to one risk factor that's associated with recidivism, not the whole breadth of the criminogenic needs and risk factors that we know to be important. Obviously, very important to do mental health assessments, but again, may or may not be associated with recidivism. In fact, a lot of the work characterizes mental health as a responsivity rather than a risk factor. And then finally, substance use assessments. So these 2 behavioral health assessments are no doubt incredibly important to treatment and intervention and even placement issues, but they aren't necessarily going to give you enough information to call that having completed a risk assessment. So, what did we find? First of all, a lot of the tools, and this is part of why I say please do not create a new one, a lot of the tools do not have as much research out there in the US as we thought there might be. The LSI is a great example. That entire family of instruments has been well researched internationally, but there were only about a handful of studies completed here in the United States. And so yes, that research is incredibly relevant, but it doesn't necessarily speak to how well they're going to function in our settings with our offender populations. The other thing I wanted to mention about this is that a lot of the work has been done by the instrument authors. And it's not to say that that's a problem necessarily, but it does suggest that they probably had better training on the instrument than might be seen if the staff aren't being trained by an instrument author. And so we see something called allegiance effects. So typically when research is completed by the person who developed the tool, there's a lot more time and effort to make sure that that tool is being implemented in the way it should be, and that all staff who are completing this assessment are trained properly. We found even fewer evaluations of inter-rater reliability, meaning if I fill out this tool and you fill out this tool, are you and I going to get the same score? Are we going to come up with the same level of risk for this offender? And so just to be aware that we want to pick an instrument that we see or we know is going to create a very consistent application across people who are filling out the tool. The last one that I wanted to mention here is that we have a lot of research evidence from this review and other reviews in the area that show that risk classification, so that final binning or categorizing of individuals as low, moderate, moderate, high, or whatever the different categories are, those really outperform the total scores. Unfortunately, what we see in practice is that many places use those total scores and they say, okay, here are my, I did the LSI, I got scores on 54 items, and then I created the total score, and we're going to use that for placement, or we're going to actually create our own categories and our own risk bins for our facility. Well, we know when you use those binning procedures and categorization procedures that were recommended by the instrument authors, those are much more accurate. And so I just am hesitant to suggest that when you go about using a tool that you just change those categories without any research to support those changes. So again, my suggestion is to use the tools in the ways that they were designed to be used. So wanted to go through how you pick one of these. I have 4 questions that I would suggest answering. So what is the evidence? And this you'll be able to look at that monograph that we developed that's going to be available on the CSG website. What is your outcome of interest? What is your population? And what are the logistics? So as long as you pick one of those tools, I think you're actually in really good shape. So any one of those tools that I put up there on the list, you're going to be better off than not using one of those tools or than creating one of your own. You want to consider, though, the evidence by outcomes. So what outcomes are you interested in your facility? Is it violations? Is it new offenses? Is it all of the above? Is it institutional infractions? Consider what populations these tools have been developed for and practiced with. And then finally, make sure that this is being implemented properly. And I'll touch on that in just a minute. So our research suggested that the salient factor score instruments actually performed best for those agencies that were interested in both new offenses and violations. In terms of focusing just on new offenses, the Ohio risk assessment instruments, the PCRA, the post-conviction risk assessment tool, and the Static Risk Offender Needs Guide did really well in terms of predicting new offenses. And then those who are only interested in violations, depending on the population, the Wisconsin instruments did very well with this. Some instruments are designed for specific populations. So the salient factor score, for example, was designed for parolees. And so I don't recommend that this is something you adopt for other offender populations. Some instruments actually have evidence that they're not particularly good at predicting outcome or recidivism with women or with other offender subgroups. And one that unfortunately doesn't do very well is the LSI. They don't seem to have very good scores for female offenders, though they are excellent at predicting recidivism in male offenders. And then finally, if you're working with a specific subgroup, so offenders with mental illnesses or offenders with substance use problems or specific race or ethnic groups, these are just caveats to say we don't have a lot of research on this. We don't actually know how well these transfer to different settings. So again, when you're considering adopting a tool, take a look at that validation research, which will be available to you in a sort of summarized, non-scientific form, and look at whether or not there is research that has applied it to that type of population. The last thing is, what are the logistics? So what information is available at your setting and what information is necessary to complete the tool? So some of the tools require all of these 4 different categories of data to be able to fill it out. But if you only have official records, well, then you can't use a tool that requires being completed through interview, let's say. I mentioned earlier that a lot of these differ tremendously in length. Do you have time to fill out a tool that has 130 items? Or are you simply at a place where you need a screening tool that you can then refer off to another group? Consider also who is going to be doing the assessments, what the training resources are, and what kind of professional background. Some of the tools require that the person either completing the assessment or supervising the completion of assessments is at least a master's level psychologist or clinician. And so you can't sort of justify picking a certain tool that then says that you need to hire a brand new person to come in and supervise the use of this tool. And then the last one is cost. I am a big fan of free stuff. So anytime we can find a tool that seems to be sort of performing fairly well as the other tools, and is also free, then that's going to be my recommendation for sustainable implementation over time. A few other things, just here, bear in mind that in research we usually have a luxury that doesn't exist in the real world. So we're going to have a lot of students, staff who get paid to do this. They're going to have a lot more time, a lot more resources, and a lot more training to fill out the assessments. Again, thinking about the level of complexity of instrument that you're interested in using. And then I also mentioned this idea of allegiance effects. In the last few minutes, I just wanted to talk about how do we actually take risk assessment and move into risk reduction. And that is the ultimate goal, right? Last time I put this slide up, I said accurate and reliable assessments do not reduce violence or offending. And there was a bit of an uproar. And it's true. Filling out an assessment is not going to create the outcomes that we're supposed to be creating to show good performance of our systems. And so in policy and practice, we've done a pretty good job of understanding that we need to implement risk assessment tools. Not as good of a job at communicating what the findings of these instruments mean and then translating them into actual practice of reducing risk over time. So for risk assessment to actually lead to risk reduction, there are 4 criteria that I think need to be satisfied. The first thing is that we have to actually implement this risk assessment tool. We've gone through, we've picked the tool we want, and now we have to actually put the resources, time, and energy into implementing it with fidelity. And in short, this really means about implementing it the way it's supposed to be used with the resources that are necessary. And I don't have time to go through the details here, but I wanted to refer you all to another free report that was developed by Gina Vincent, Laura Guy, and Tom Grisso, which was about how to implement structured risk assessment tools. They were focusing on the juvenile justice setting, but I think it applies to any setting that you're working with. So this is a free online report that gives 8 steps to go through to ensure that you've implemented the risk assessment tool with fidelity. The one thing I did want to mention here is that this is not a one-off task. So there's going to need to be a long-term plan into how you implement these things over time. And there's going to need to be revisiting every few months, every 6 months, every year on things like training issues, staffing, resources, and that sort of thing. The second criteria for reducing risk as a fallout or as a result of risk assessment is that it needs to be communicated. And I know in my own training as a forensic psychologist, I don't know that I ever had a class or specific training on how to communicate the findings of my risk assessments. And so in the literature, I wanted to just touch on a couple of things that we know are best practices in terms of, or recommended practices, I should say, in terms of communicating results. And this could be communicating verbally between staff. It could be writing it down for a report on a file. It could be about posting a notice in terms of just staff changeovers or shift changes. Or it could be about writing reports for parole boards or courts. The first thing is to be explicit. How was the assessment completed? Using what tool? Using what information? I always recommend saying and identifying all of the limitations up front. I didn't have access to family members. I only had 3 months worth of information, or whatever it is, so that the person on the receiving end knows exactly what limitations your risk assessment comes with. Know the target audience. I'm certainly not going to communicate to correctional officers the results of my risk assessment the same way I might write it for a judge. Contextualize the risk. What scenarios, what settings, what would be present at the time that this outcome would be likely to occur. We know that offenders are not walking around just generally waiting to attack somebody, well, generally speaking. And so what are the different circumstances that would be in place, or the scenarios or contingencies that would lead up to an actual incident of recidivism? This is a fabulous quote, I think really drives home the point that improper risk communication can render a risk assessment that was otherwise very well conducted completely useless, or even worse, if it gives the consumers the wrong impression. And so the idea that you could be doing the best job with the best tool and the best process in place, but if it's not being communicated, we're actually doing a disservice to the entire process and potentially increasing risk. The third criteria here is that it needs to be integrated into a case plan. I certainly don't have time to show you how to do that today, but this is an area that's been emerging in the field, and there's a few take-home messages that I wanted you to have. Your case plan needs to be commensurate with the risk level, and so this is the risk principle. So we want to focus on those high-risk offenders. So once we identify the level of risk, really sort of easy to want to focus and spend your time with the low-risk offenders that are easy to work with and pleasant to be around, and that we can think will affect change in more easily without a lot of resistance. But it's the high-risk group that we need to focus on. We have to be wary of the needs principle and really think about the areas of risk and criminogenic need. So somebody, again, whose substance use is not necessarily a core feature of their offending behavior, well then it is certainly a treatment need, but it is not necessarily a criminogenic need. Building on the existing strengths, what do they have in place so that we're not having to do everything from scratch? Do they have family? Do they have a history of employment or some skill set that they can build upon? Can we think about things that get them excited, whether it's art or sports or other activities that might actually motivate them? In addition to therapeutic alliance, we know that motivation is one of the most important predictors of treatment outcome. And so it's important to find things that will motivate this individual to participate and engage in the process. And then finally, it needs to be delivered in a way that's appropriate. So if we have an offender with cognitive impairments, with mental health issues, it might not be the best approach to throw at them a very high-level psychoeducational program, even though it's an evidence-based practice with very good treatment outcomes. It probably won't work for that one individual. And then the last piece here is this idea of evaluating and amending over time. If we're doing intervention and we're doing it well and we're doing it in a way that's affecting change, well, well, then we need to think about changing what we do over time as well. We're not going to keep belaboring home the same issues and the same points. And that's my fourth criteria. So this case management plan, as well as the risk assessment, they have to have an explicit shelf life. And so here, a priori, there needs to be a mechanism and a timeline for review. So at that time of the risk assessment, I actually train and advise individuals I work with to write down what the best before or the milk date is on that assessment. When do I have to come back to this? How long is this good for? So if somebody sees, oh, there's been a risk assessment done previously on file, well, it could have been done in 2005 and it's now 2014. So we need to come back with a timeline and some sort of oversight mechanism to say, when are we going to revisit these issues? It also needs to be modified as necessary. Circumstances change, staff change, things in this individual's life might change. Coming back to the idea of the broken leg dilemma, we need to be considering what sort of caveats or life changes might be relevant to and prompt a reevaluation. That said, I'm not saying you need to go through the whole thing all from scratch. I really am strongly suggesting that you look at what was done and say, what's changed for better, for worse? What is the same that we don't need to revisit? And what do we need to do differently? What isn't working about what we're doing, and thinking about how we can use that to actually improve the outcomes. And with that, I provide some of my contact information up there, and I'm happy to deal individually with any questions that might come up.